Welcome students to lecture 10 of MHHS 1. Today we get more into the meat of Susan Zeger's essay, Holmes's Pipe, Tobacco Papers, and the 19th Century Origins of Media Addiction. Last time I talked about the broad strokes of the argument about the connections between 19th century tobacco addiction and media addiction. It turned out that the history of the way we've understood addiction is not about our conventional notions of medical science, discovering a kind of material malfunction of the brain and synthesizing a drug to adjust that neurochemical mechanism. In our contemporary technocratic world, that would seem to be the only rational way to think about addiction. But what I think Zeger has shown us wonderfully is that cultural constructions of addiction are just as important. In today's lecture, we'll get into some specific examples of how the image of the smoking reader as the media addict is part of both the character of Sherlock Holmes and the voracious consumer of Doyle's detective fiction. And at the end, I'll model how to use an academic article to stimulate further thought and reflection. So I'm doing this because sometimes you might be so wrapped up in understanding an academic article that you think it's somehow this kind of self-contained, standalone, untouchable, perfect thing. But academic articles live on as long as we keep thinking about them and exploring their implications. So at the end, I'll offer some reflections on how Zeger's argument made me rethink one of my favorite Sherlock Holmes stories, The Sign of Four, a work that Zeger references in passing twice, but never fully analyzes. The first body section of the essay, called Self-Medication in Smoke and Print, begins with a quick history of smoking tobacco and its relationship to reading. We start really early at the beginning of the 17th century, when both smoking and reading print were prohibitively expensive things for most people. At the beginning of the 19th century, there was still this kind of 17th century notion of the, quote, genteel masculine readership of tobacco media. It was, in short, about elite men sociably interacting with other elite men in fancy pants environments. But as the century went on, and all these things got much cheaper and more accessible, quote, tobacco smoking moved unevenly from a customary social activity to a solitary habitual behavior. So the character of Sherlock Holmes smartly evokes both models of tobacco smoking: the sociable, conversation-starting cherrywood pipe when he's discussing cases with other people, and the solitary clay pipe when he's wrapped up in his own head, working out all the deductions over a smoke. So it's a smart move on Doyle's part because of the relationship the character constructs with his readers. Holmes is supposed to be this ethereal genius that's way above everyone else in terms of deductive ability. He solves problems that you can't. But the association of his character with all the puzzles and brain teasers that also appeared in the magazine The Strand made him just like the reader of detective fiction. They were both consumed in concentrated bursts of mental activity to figure out these cool and neat puzzles. So the character was at once amazing and relatable, an exceptional hero and an everyman, a perfectly calculated combination that got readers addicted, that made readers have to keep coming back. So the smoking reader was now a mass aesthetic rather than an elite activity of important rich men having conversations with other important rich men. But it wasn't just about the isolation of the new smoking reader either. Zeger calls it a kind of, quote, simulated conversation carried out in print. Reading was like smoking tobacco, a kind of self-medication that you dose out for short periods of heightened activity. So this mass aesthetic becomes consuming not just for Holmes, but for the everyman, and the detective uses it as a way to understand the behavior of the common person. He even develops a technique to identify different kinds of tobacco ash, and several cases hinge on Holmes's remarkable ability to single out clues from smoking behavior. And he could only do this because he himself was a compulsive smoker. By the end of the 19th century, tobacco addiction was becoming recognized as a kind of medical pathology. And Holmes encapsulated the idea of a new modern subject who's somewhere between unconscious behavior and self-conscious style, as Ziegler puts it. He was a man of conscious self-fashioning, but he was also driven by unconscious drives, pathologies that lurked in his brain. So his navigation of these unconscious drives through his conscious detective work was a large part of the appeal and the attraction to his character. So to illustrate all this, we get a series of three wonderful images to show this mass aesthetic of the new smoking reader of the late 19th century. So let's take a look at these three images. These three images show us three aspects of the smoking reader as media addict. So first, this new, quote, bourgeois identity that Ziegler talks about is a careless consumer, completely wrapped up in his content. We're supposed to find this first image somewhat funny, and to us, it probably looks very modern, like someone who's completely absorbed by their phone and social media and slowly developing text neck. So it looks like a very expensive private library, but this guy has really just made a mess out of the place. There are books piled up on the floor. There's a pipe carelessly laid out in the foreground. This guy just doesn't care because he's buried his entire upper body in the expensive-looking book while blowing smoke an inch away from the expensive paper. So the comedy comes from the pairing of incommensurate things. All the supposedly genteel, elite, fancy things around him, and this guy's really middle-brow, careless, and absorptive smoking and reading. All right, so the second image has this kind of comedic incommensurability. There is this wise-looking bearded man sitting cross-legged on a couch, smoking a pipe, perhaps deep in thoughts. But what we actually see in his smoky thought bubble is just porn. And if you read the terrible verse at the bottom, you can confirm that he's just basically thinking the shallowest thoughts possible. And finally, the third image of Holmes concentrating on a written clue is perhaps a bit more serious and complicated than a guy trashing an expensive library or a guy just thinking intensely about porn. So in this image of Holmes as a media addict, we see Holmes as a new kind of genius, one that isn't really about pure originality or about pure creativity, but a genius of mediation. He isn't a genius of originality. Instead, we see his detecting gaze indirectly meeting his clue through a plume of smoke. What Ziegler wants us to notice about this image is that this doesn't look like originality. The smoking reader, as media addict, is not original. He is a consumer and reproducer. He's just really mastered all the media and information technologies of the time to become the best detective in the world. He uses transportation and information networks, tobacco ash, newspapers, telegraphy, telephony, and if you're familiar with the lore of the Sherlock Holmes canon, his spy network of the Baker Street Irregulars. As Ziegler puts it, though, Holmes's labor actually looks like pleasure, with the intense excitement produced by tobacco smoke. It might just look like a guy just idly smoking a pipe, but the image shows the new kind of intellectual labor of the late 19th century. The easiest, I think, contemporary example to make this clear, if this wasn't clear already, of this new image of the Holmesian detective might be the job of a social media influencer. So they have to navigate and mediate all sorts of media and become masters of those technologies. But the image that we see is of idleness, of laborlessness, and of effortlessness. Holmes's intellectual labor is similarly disguised and masked as addictive pleasure. An amazing fantasy, just like the carefully curated social media presence of an influencer. The next section gets us to Zegar's close reading of The Man with the Twisted Lip. So just to recap the Holmes story, it's basically a weird non-story. There's no murder to solve here. A guy goes missing, but it turns out he was just living a double life as a beggar because he was able to make easier money than in his regular job. So the character of Holmes comes from some predecessor detective stories like by the likes of Edgar Allan Poe and Wilkie Collins, but there's something stranger about this iteration of the detective. So those older detectives also smoked, but Holmes's smoking is much more self-reflexive, self-aware, and he seems to represent a new kind of labor in the 19th century. Smoking is no longer just an ancillary affectation, but something that represents in the Sherlock Holmes stories the thought process itself. So remember those three images from before. The plume of smoke rising from the comically large book, the smoky thought bubble, and the mediating smoke between Holmes and his written clue. So there's no good way of just narrating the deductive thought process without just giving away the suspense of the answer. So Doyle has smoking stand in as both metaphor and metonymy for all the twisted paths that Holmes pursues in his detective brain. So it is a metaphor, smoke is thought, because the two things don't seem related. But it is also a metonymy. Smoke comes from thought-provoking rolled-up print puzzles and ephemera because of the literal connection between smoking and print. So if these figures, metaphor and metonymy, are not familiar, here's just an easy way to think about it. Just think of metaphor as linking two things that have nothing to do with each other, and think of metonymy as linking things that are already closely related. So the main insight of the close reading here, Zegar's close reading here, is the triangulation of three figures here. The fake beggar, Holmes, and the avid reader of detective fiction. So at the conclusion of the story, the regular police, Inspector Bradstreet, is amazed at Holmes's deductive skills and asks him how he did it. In his funny and revealing answer, Holmes said that he did it by, quote, sitting upon 5 pillows and consuming an ounce of shag. This, as Zegar reads it, is a clever winking about the fake beggar's paradoxical labor and the impenetrable deductive thought of the detective. Quote, Holmes's cheeky retort to Bradstreet, again, that's the regular police, that he solved the mystery by smoking, winks at readers. Tobacco proves that thinking really is pleasure rather than labor, the abiding fantasy that Holmes embodies. Holmes's solving the case by smoking mimics readers' experience with the story, which was likely consumed while sitting and, as with tobacco, once finished, used up. Pleasure and effort combine in a smoky spectacle that self-consciously rewards readers for their compulsive consumption. So here, we can clearly picture these three seated figures together. The fake beggar sitting and asking for money, the detective sitting on 5 pillows and smoking, and the readers who are at the edge of their seats trying to figure out the mystery before Holmes does. All three of these figures are there to authorize a fantasy of pleasurable labor. And anything that deviates from that flattering fantasy of effortless consumption must be written out. So to illustrate this, Zegar notes that Doyle's inspiration for this story was actually a real-life story of a journalist who posed as a beggar, but in that story, he discovered that it was actually much more work than he expected, which is not what happens in Doyle's story. Instead, Doyle makes it look easy in the story. The guy is now a journalist, but he was also a former actor, and that skill set made him really good at begging and eliciting sympathy and money from his marks. So another drug Opium had a long history of being associated with complex intoxication and unpleasurable trips. And you can see De Quincey's opium eater for all these gory details. So instead of this kind of orientalized, all-consuming drug of opium, Doyle prefers to have his detective indulge in the more mainstream tobacco, an anglicized version of addiction that has more of a tinge of fun than exoticized danger. So opium is exotic, it's enslaving, tobacco is genteel, and it's British. So this is, returning to my analogy, the fantasy of influencer consumption, of blithe media addiction that hides any pain, labor, exploitation, or pathology behind an easy persona that effortlessly produces rewarding social media content. So Zeger really doesn't touch on the ending of the story, but I'll just tell you that the fake beggar doesn't really get any comeuppance. And why would he, right? He's part of that triangulation of the fantasy of effortless work and production. Of course, Doyle smartly realized that the detective fiction reader wouldn't want to be put on blast for wasting their time reading all of these addictive stories. In the end, the reader is just like that fake beggar, and they both get away with it. This lecture seems to be running a little bit long, so I'll just keep this part short. To conclude, I just want to model briefly how reading this article sparked some more smoky thought about one of my favorite Sherlock Holmes stories, The Sign of Four. Zeger, as you may recall, brings up this novel twice in the essay. It's one of the 4 novel-length Sherlock Holmes stories. The others, like The Man with the Twisted Lip, are much shorter. So Zeger opens with a scene from The Sign of Four, with Holmes, quote, injecting cocaine, opening a book, and lighting his briar pipe. And in the second reference, Zeger points to a part in the story in which Holmes smokes some tobacco and reaches for, quote, a bulky volume, a gazetteer which is now being published. So in the opening reference, the point is that cocaine is for stimulation, while Holmes doesn't have a case and is just really bored. Tobacco is the drug of choice during the case because of its complex ties to labor and pleasure that we've talked about already. So in the second reference, Zeger is just giving another example of how smoking and reading are largely interchangeable in the Holmes stories. Those are the references we get to The Sign of Four. Zeger doesn't explore The Sign of Four much other than these 2 references. And this is not to throw shade. She actually doesn't need to in order to make her argument. But instead of thinking how much her argument applies to this earlier novel, I was actually more struck by how much the novel is dissimilar to The Man with the Twisted Lip. There is a lot more action in The Sign of Four, but again, I'll just try to boil it down to just a few plot points to give you a taste of it. So Mary Morstan comes to 221B Baker Street asking Holmes and Watson for help. Her father, Captain Morstan, a convict guard in the Andaman Islands, was supposed to visit her in London but had gone missing. The father turns out to be dead, and more murders happen later. The culprits turn out to be Jonathan Small, a one-legged man, and his accomplice Tonga, a native of the Andaman Islands. So there's a visit to a house with looted treasure from India after the 1857 rebellion. There's a foot chase with a bloodhound, and an exciting boat chase culminating in a poisonous blow dart that nearly kills Holmes. So I've highlighted these particular plot points to show just how different this story sounds. The appeal of the later, shorter Holmes stories, according to Zeger, was about the flattering of the media addict reader who is indolently sitting in a chair and compulsively consuming detective stories. The Sign of Four, however, doesn't hide the massive imperial project of the British occupation of India. In fact, there's a whole episode in the story about the Indian Rebellion and stolen treasure. The story isn't about Holmes just sitting down and smoking a pipe, but instead an active Holmes running around all over the place with a bloodhound and chasing down criminals on a boat. It's very different. So this earlier Holmes story, The Sign of Four, is not as self-reflexive without winking quality to the reader. There's just too much work in this kind of detective work. Too much of the labor actually looked hard. The real pleasure of reading these stories, according to Ziegler, is the fantasy of the smoking reader figuring out everything while sitting and smoking, obsessing over media. So you don't have to think about, for example, Chinese immigrants and opium. You don't have to think about imperial exploitation in India. You don't have to think about the global trade in cocaine or anything that requires you to get out of your smoking chair. So what Ziegler's article helped me to see is how Doyle started to tailor a more indolent Holmes to the budding media addict consumer of Holmes's story. No more running around and no more boat chases. The readers wanted instead the fantasy of a media addict like them who can manage everything with a pipe and a chair. So Doyle was also medically trained and modeled Holmes on one of his medical professors. I think what Doyle was trying to authorize was this image of the armchair detective expert who knows everything and can get from problem to solution, from medical symptom to medical diagnosis with maximal efficiency. So what we've learned from this essay then is that the history of addiction is not just about neurochemical reactions that created substance dependency, but a kind of media history that slowly constructed what addiction means in the first place.